Here we are. Is this first time for anybody? You folks haven't been here before? You haven't been here before?
We've been moved here.
Oh, well, you're off the hook then.
And I don't live here. She's visiting.
And you're visiting. Okay, all three of you are off the hook. Never mind. So I've been doing this for about 25 years. So what I do now is I pick a theme for the year and then I divide it into 12 topics. So if you just come to one program, it stands alone, but if you come to all of them, they sort of knit together for the year. And this year I'm talking about, in particular, how's that? You like that?
That's gross.
Yeah, is that gross? No, I don't think so. Can you get the lights? I'm talking about 12 dozen things about Colorado. And what that's about is each month I pick one topic and then I divide that. I have one theme and I divide it into 12 topics, do one topic a month. They stand alone or they tie together. So this year it's 12 dozen things about Colorado. So there are 12 months in the year and each month I give you 12 things that I bet you didn't know about Colorado. And since you just moved here, this could be really helpful to you.
Right.
Yeah. Where'd you move from?
Iowa.
Whereabouts in Iowa?
Ames.
Really? Son of a gun. What took you so long?
We're retired.
I was born and raised in Des Moines. And I came out here in '74 to go to college and saw no reason to go back to Iowa. So, welcome. Yeah. And where are you visiting from?
I'm visiting from Florida.
Whoa.
However, I'm originally from Fort Dodge, Iowa.
Uh-huh. There you go. So you're out of the way of the hurricane right now.
Right.
Yeah, well, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So what I do is I present 12 things each month that I suspect you don't know about. And since there are 12 months and there are 12 things, that's 144. And as I've been known to say, that makes Colorado gross. But in a good way, not in a bad way. Okay? So this month is session 9 of 12, Wildlife Diversity. What lives here? Do you have any idea how many different kinds of things live in Colorado? Any guesses?
6,743.
6,743. That's just about the number of beetles in the state of Colorado. We'll find out in just a little bit. So what I want to do is start out with a little bit about classification so that some of this stuff will kind of make sense as we go along. In the 1970s, when most of us were still in junior high, maybe not. The way the textbooks were in biology, everything was divided into plants and animals. If it was alive and it was on planet Earth, it was either plant or an animal. So all the fungi, all the bacteria, all the algae were in the plant kingdom, and then all the little amoeba things and what have you, and the big animals were in the animal kingdom, and that was that. But that was something that was embedded in tradition, and it was hard to overcome. 30 or so years before that, a guy came up with the idea that we needed more kingdoms than just two because life wasn't that uniform. And so in the 1980s, this came into the textbooks, and they started teaching this new concept where we divided the life on Earth into 5 kingdoms. The monarans were all the bacteria and the things that were bacteria-like. And then the protistans, those are your basic amoebas and paramecia and the things you looked at through the microscope. Plants, and then the fungi were separated out from the plants because the reason why they were originally connected with the plants is because every cell has its own cell wall. And because it has a cell wall, then fungi and plants must be related because animals don't have that. Well, then we developed these new laboratory techniques with new instrumentation and new knowledge and what have you, and we could figure out what those cell walls were made of. And in plants, it's made of a very stable, complex sugar, and in fungi, It's a different sort of thing that shows up in the shells of insects and crustaceans and that sort of thing. And it became evidence that the fungi are more closely related to animals than they are to plants. And so now they're broken out as a separate kingdom. But that was the 1980s. Along comes the 1990s, and a guy comes up with an idea that there is a higher level than the kingdom, and life should be divided into these 3 domains. So the bacteria became one domain, and then the archaeans, which are bacteria-like, were in another domain, and then the eukaryotes. Do you have any idea what a eukaryote is? For a small extra fee, I'll tell you. Anybody have a chocolate chip cookie they want to give up? So there are 2 groups, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. In the eukaryotes, the genetic material is inside a membrane that forms a nucleus in the cell. In prokaryotes, there's no membrane, there's no nucleus, and the genetic material just floats around in the protoplasm of the cell. 2 very different life systems. So here we have the eukaryotes forming one of 3 domains, and they now have 4 kingdoms: plants, protists, fungi, and animals. Does that make sense? And just about the time you're comfortable with it, along comes the 2000s, and a guy decides, you know, domains aren't the right way to look at this. We need empires instead of domains. And he's going back to the idea of prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and the bacteria and the archaeans are in the prokaryote empire, and everything else is in the eukaryote empire. And the way it is today in 2019, it all depends on whose biology class you're in and which textbook they use, because about 60% of them use the domain concept and about 40% use the empire concept. And so neither one is dominating over the other one, and they're both in use. So you may look up something in one book and then something else on the internet, and in one case they use the idea of domains, in another case empires, and you're wondering what's going on here. And it's just that we're not done learning yet. And so that becomes thing 1. Classification is dynamic. It's not static. And it's dynamic because we're not done learning about life on Earth yet. We keep learning new things, and so we have to adjust with what we learn that's new.
Is the concept of kingdom completely gone now?
No. Now we have 3 domains, and then each domain is subdivided into kingdoms. And then the kingdoms are subdivided into phyla, and the phyla into classes, and then orders, and so on down the ladder. And you all remember that from 8th grade biology, right? 12th grade biology? Freshman biology. You have a neighbor who tells you this stuff. Whatever. So that's thing 1. Classification is not static, it's ongoing, and we keep learning new stuff. So here's why classification matters. The first part of it is it organizes information in a manner that improves our collective knowledge about life on Earth. And because we look at how things are related, suddenly the use of names becomes instructive and helpful. If I say the word frog, we all conjure up an image of a frog that's pretty much similar. When I say frog, nobody's got a picture of an octopus in their heads, do they? If you do, would you admit it? So, if I say turtle, or if I say robin, or I say acorn, these are words that mean something very specific, and we're able to communicate because we share the same meanings of the words. What classification does is it brings order and organization to what we know about the relatedness of life on Earth, so that when we use names, they mean something. Does that make sense? Just say yes. Yes. There you go. The other part about it is classification improves our communication among different groups of people that need to know that kind of knowledge. If you're in the agriculture business and somebody's got a grasshopper problem, you need to know that there are those grasshoppers that eat farm crops and those grasshoppers that don't. And there's no sense in spending a lot of money to control grasshoppers that aren't eating the crops. And if your job is to manage trees, and you need to be able to manage these trees against that fungus that's spread around by that stupid little bark beetle that causes the trees to die, you need to be able to tell one fungus from another, and you need to be able to figure out if they really are bark beetles or if they're something else. And so suddenly, understanding relatedness and identity matter in a variety of professions, especially in health science. You might get sick and need to go to the hospital, and you've got something making you sick. You need a medical team that can figure out whether you've got a virus or a bacterium or a parasite, and they need to know one kind of bacterium from another, one kind of fungus from another, because not all bacteria respond to the same kind of antibiotics. And you've got to have the right antibiotic for the right bacterium, and that sort of thing. And so suddenly, in the realm of health management, classification matters. And then, classification stimulates the continuation of research. Like I said with Thing 1, we're not done learning yet, and the more we learn, the better we get at handling all this stuff. And finally, this is one I've been promoting for over 20 years in bird classes, wildflower classes, and that sort of thing. And what it is that classification serves as a memory system for the non-academic wildlife enthusiasts who want to remember and understand their encounters with life, with nature. You know, some of you are old enough to remember a radio character named Fibber McGee. And he is pretty famous for having this really messy closet, right? And whenever he opened it up, there was 30 seconds of crashing noises of stuff falling out of the closet. And it became one of the biggest laugh lines on entertainment radio in the 50s and early 60s. Well, if you treat your memory like Fibber McGee's closet, when you want to remember a wildlife encounter to share with a friend, a neighbor, a relative, or whoever, if you don't have it in your memory in a meaningful sort of way, how do you find it? Where's that memory? Can you remember what wildlife you have seen? And so suddenly, classification becomes a memory cubbyhole system where all your experiences with mammals go over here, and all your experience with birds go in here, and all your experience with wildflowers go over here. And when you start thinking of classification that way, it gets easier to remember the wildlife that you have encountered. I have been at this for a long time. Trust me on this. Don't fight me. You'll lose. Okay? So, thing 2. Classification is not just for scientists and scholars, it is also useful for the wildlife enthusiasts. And I should add, if you understand classification, then it makes it easier to look up things in field guide books and information books and look for stuff on the internet, because classification can take you right where you're going, so you don't have to wander around hoping you come up with something. And so it's a way for you to learn stuff better and faster. So, from my column last week, when considering the wildlife diversity of a place like Colorado, life itself can become a destination. Yeah, there are people who go see the Eiffel Tower and they go see the Grand Canyon. They travel cross country to watch grown men play games with balls. If people can do that, why can't you travel to go see life itself? Oh, wait a minute. You can. There's an entire industry called ecotourism. And it's huge. It's huge. Wildlife watching in Colorado today has more people than the number of hunters and fishers combined. And the economic impact that those wildlife watchers have on local commerce is greater than the impact of hunters and fishers combined. Ecotourism in the state of Colorado brings in just under $3 billion of revenue a year. to restaurants and hotels, motels, beds and breakfasts, places that sell warmer socks and better gloves, places that can replace a binocular. All those kinds of things figure into the realm of wildlife watching. If you want to go find life on purpose, it's perfectly okay because there are people already doing it. People will pay money to go to Africa to see jackals, and yet they haven't even seen all 4 fox species in the state of Colorado. Did you even know we had 4 fox species? Yeah, see, this is why you people need me. Yeah. So, considering all the kingdoms, whether we talk about domains or empires, Colorado probably has between 60,000 and 100,000 species of life. Isn't that remarkable to think of? We don't know for sure because there are a lot of wildlife groups that have never been studied and thoroughly documented, and so we know they're here, but we don't know how many different kinds. And we'll talk more about that as we come along. So, as much as I would like to, we cannot cover them all. So, I have with some difficulty decided we're going to skip the bacteria, the cyanobacteria, algae, amoebas, euglenias, paramecia, rotifers, hydras, jellyfishes, gastrotrix, planarians, tapeworms, flukes, hookworms, pinworms, nematodes, hairworms, bryozoans, cladocerans, copepods, amphipods, and ostracods.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's all right with you? You guys are good with that? Yeah. Okay, yeah. So there are some amazing things out there. Like we have one little jellyfish that lives here in Colorado. Did you even know there was such a thing as a freshwater jellyfish? And then there's this hairworm right next to that nickel. They have some really amazing lifestyles. Some of them get to be 3 feet long, and they're no bigger around than a fat hair. They have to develop into adulthood inside an insect. And sometimes what happens is the larva gets inside the insect, and as it's transforming, the insect dies because some stupid bird comes along and eats it. So instead of it dying, it remains in the bird, but it's dormant until the bird dies, and then when the bird dies, things like flies and beetles come along to eat the dead bird. They eat the dormant hairworm, and that brings the hairworm back to life. It's now in the insect, and it finishes its life cycle. Is that amazing or what? I mean, that's almost science fiction, people. So, we're just going to look at plants, fungi, and animals and look at them in their sequence. So, plants, we'll start there. What would a salad be without plants? An empty bowl, pretty much. So, the thing about plants is they come in 2 major groups, and then one of the major groups is subdivided into 2 other groups. The first major group are non-vascular plants. What we mean by that is they don't have any specialized cells that connect together to move fluids. And so every individual cell of the plant has to absorb its own water. It doesn't get water delivered to it by a set of cells. Your vascular system are your arteries and your veins and your capillaries. And plants have those kinds of fluid transport systems as well, but not the non-vascular plants. They have no specialized cells that come together to form the organs of a plant, and in botany, roots, stems, and leaves are considered to be the 3 organ types of plants. And though they have both asexual and sexual reproduction, they don't form seeds. A seed is a baby plant that goes dormant and has a waiting period before it germinates and comes to life. And so they don't make those. So what are we talking about here? Liverworts are one of them. They're thin-bodied plants that form mats on the ground, and they're called liverworts because the plants have 3 lobes like the human liver, and back in the days of the 14 and 1500s, people thought that that meant that it was good medicine to help the liver. And so wort is Old English for plant, and liver means the human liver. It's shaped like the human liver, therefore it must be good medicine for the liver. It's not. So you look for these along stream banks and other moist to wet places up in the mountains. Then we have hornworts, so named because if you look right here, there's this horn-like projection, and that's where these plants make their spores. And so they are horn-bearing plants, hence hornworts. We only have 2 species in Colorado. I've been looking for them for 45 years and haven't found any yet. So if I were you, I wouldn't make them a priority. I'm just suggesting. Then we have mosses. Most people recognize mosses when they see them, but most people are unaware of how diverse they are and how they fit into the whole scheme of things. Are you familiar with that little gray bird that lives along streams in the mountains and they bob up and down like this, so they call them dippers, right? Well, a lot of them make 100% of their nesting material is moss. So moss matters to that little bird. And there are other birds that use mosses in their nests as well. So, you remember that tardigrade I showed up at the beginning? Those little guys live between the what you would think of as leaves, but they're not really leaves, but they're living in the moisture droplets in between these things on the mosses. And so all you have to do is pluck a little bit of it, take it home, put it in some non-chlorinated water like bottled water or aquarium water, because chlorine will kill the tardigrades, and you can see them with a magnifying glass. That's all the harder it is. Go and do that between now and next month I'll ask you how many you found. Okay, maybe not. So, do any of you like reading general nature writing books, natural history type stuff, and what have you? There is a really good book that won the Burroughs Award for 2004, and it's called Gathering Moss. And it was written by a lady who is a PhD botanist at a university, but she's also a Potawatomi Indian, and she's the mother of 2 girls. And so she weaves her life of being a researcher in botany at a university with her life as a mother and her traditions as an Indian, a Potawatomi, to tell the story of mosses. It is just such a gentle read, and you say, I'll be darned, I never knew that, or why would somebody care about that, or what have you. But you come away feeling like, I'm glad I read this book, Gathering Moss. It may be right here in the library. So then we have vascular plants. That's our second big group, but then it subdivides, and one of the groups is they're seedless. And so they have these tubes that form by cells that connect end to end, and they move fluids through the plant, but the plant doesn't form seeds. So it may form leaves and stems and roots with specialized tissues, but no seeds. And that includes things like the lycopods. Lycos from the Greek for wolf and pod for foot, because if you dig down into the ground, the part underground often looks like the paws of a dog or a wolf, and so that's where the name came from. We have 3 groups in Colorado, the club mosses here, and the spike mosses, and then we also have quillworts that only live in high mountain lakes. Anybody remember the column I wrote last year about going up to Rocky and being followed by a moose 3 times? Anybody remember reading that? Does anybody know that I write a newspaper column? Does anybody know that there is a newspaper here in town? So last year I was up at Rocky 3 times, and I was looking for these club mosses, and each time I went in there was this same bull moose, and I could tell it was the same because it had a bent antler. And I would walk in and it would follow me, and when I stopped and turned around, it stopped. And if I walked toward it, it would turn around and walk away from me, and did this 3 times. And so that moose and I got to be friends. So, at any rate, there are lycopods, and then there are horsetails. And we got 2 different kinds of horsetails in Colorado. There are only 15 species in the whole world, and 4 of them live in Colorado. A couple of them only put up 1 stem, and it's green, and at the top is a little cone-like structure that makes the spores, and the rest of the plant does photosynthesis, and that's all there is, except what's below ground. But there's another one that puts up little short stems that are brown in the spring of the year and the snow's just melting, and it has the little cone on top that makes the spores, and when the spores are all done, it just withers away, but then the underground part pulls up these shoots, and those are green, and they grow to be quite tall. They can be 2 or 3 feet tall, and those are the things that do the photosynthesis to make the sugars that feed the plant. So 2 different kinds of stems from the same plant depending on what they're doing. And then, of course, we have ferns. Does that look like your everyday run-of-the-mill fern? No, but it's a true fern. It's called water clover because it has that 4-lobed frond that looks like a 4-leaf clover, but they are not flowering plants. They are true ferns, and they live in pooled water out on the plains. And a really easy place to find them is out on County Road 96 on Pawnee National Grassland. And they grow in the water. If the water goes away, they can keep right on growing. They can grow in the soil as well as in the water, so they're pretty hardy. These are a reason why when you go visit a place like Pawnee, you park the car, you get out, and you go walking. Otherwise, you never get to see stuff like this and a whole lot more. Don't just drive through Pawnee grassland and say you've been there. If all you do is drive through it, that's all you did was drive through it. You got to park, get out, and go walking. Because I said so. So, then we have what are called vascular seeded plants, and these produce very elaborate vascular systems of specialized cells, phloem and xylem, and they make the organ types, roots, stems, and leaves, but in some of them, some of the stems are modified and they are all bunched together with scales, and the seeds form on top of the scales. And then in others, the leaves are specialized into forming flowers. And so these are really a very sophisticated group of plants. They have both asexual and sexual reproduction, and the consequence of the sexual reproduction is they make true seeds. And so there are 3 groups of these. One would be the conifers. And you can see the cone right up there, and that's a modified little branchlet sort of thing, or twig. And in the northern hemisphere, north of the equator, all of the conifers produce long needle-like leaves. If you get south of the equator, there are some conifers that produce wider leaves that are suggestive of willows, but they're still conifers and not flowering plants. But we don't get them up here. Another group would be the neophytes, and the neophytes are in western Colorado and on into Utah and what have you. And it includes one of the species that was known as Mormon tea. And in these plants is a chemical called ephedrine. A lot of people pronounce it ephedrine. But if you remember your grammar, if you have an E at the end of the word with a consonant in front of that and then a vowel, you pronounce it ephedrine, not ephedrine. I'm just trying to help. Well, it dilates the bronchi and the bronchioles in the lungs for people that have asthma and other conditions that cause these to collapse. And it works fabulously, and it was used for about 100 years. But the problem is, in a certain number of people, it makes the heart go berserk, and the heart, instead of pumping, it starts vibrating, and so the blood doesn't circulate, and doctors can't get the vibrating to stop. The regular electroshocking doesn't work. The chemicals they use, like epinephrine, what have you, they don't work. And so for a lot of people, they don't recover from it and they die. And because of that complication, it's become less used, and now it's kind of a last resort for people that are struggling to breathe. And then there are the fruitifers. Now, 3 of you are new here. You need to become familiar with this. I am a professional writer, and so I have a license to invent words when necessary. And so if you have a group of plants that make their seeds in cones, and we call them conifers. Does it not make sense that if the plant produces its seeds in fruits, we would call them?
Fruitifers.
Look how it rolls off the tongue, people. Isn't that amazing? And I am here. You know, just a quick story on this. I was doing a week-long elder hostel a number of years ago, and we were out in the field and we were looking at some wildflowers, and these two people from Illinois said, yeah, these are fruitifers, and they were talking to somebody else. And I whipped my head around and I said, where did you come up with that word? And they said, oh, we're part of a nature center back in Illinois, and some of the members came out here on an elder hostel thing a couple years ago, and they had this class from some guy that told them about fruitifers, and they brought it back, and it made so much sense that we're all using it now. And I said, oh, I was that guy. It's coming to a dictionary near you soon. So, these are some very sophisticated plants in the way they live and the chemicals they produce and their ecological connections. And so, the flowering plants are really kind of amazing. So here are some of the fruitifer families that are fairly commonly known, with a couple of extras thrown in. Like up there in the birches, you see hazelnuts. Hazelnuts are members of the birch family. How many of you knew that? See, this is why you people need me. Yeah. That's why you're here again, huh? Yeah. So the fringe trees down here include the ashes that we're familiar with that make the wood for Louisville sluggers and what have you. But in that same family belong the olives that give us those yummy little green things and black things and what have you. And then one of the things you need to understand here is I do things differently than other people. Have you ever noticed that? That's never come across? So the way I do it is, instead of using old names that have just become entrenched in tradition, I look at a family of squirrels or a family of mice or bats or butterflies or plants or whatever else, and I look to find the most abundant group. And then that group becomes the namesake for the family. So when you see a name up here, it tells you within that family, those are the most abundant and diverse members of that family. So over here, you have eringos and then parsleys. Well, the eringos worldwide in South America, Europe, Asia, and Africa, they outnumber the parsleys about 3 to 1. So instead of calling it the parsley family, I call it the eringo family, and then I let you know there are other things like the parsleys that are a part of that family. If you look up here, you see milk vetches. A lot of people refer to those as the pea family. After tonight, you'll never do that again. There are only 6 species of peas in the whole wide world, but milk vetches, there are 2,204 species worldwide. And so that is the most diverse group within the family. And so I use that as the namesake for the entire family. So when you see these names up here, penstemons, orchids, phloxes, that tells you those are a group within the family, and they are the most abundant or diverse group within that family. So the names I choose actually convey information. I'll let you mellow on that for a moment so you can see the wonder behind it. Why didn't somebody else come up with this decades ago? So that's just a few of the families we have in Colorado. Here's a summary of the plant kingdom. We have 104 liverworts. How many of you even knew there was such a thing as liverworts? 3 of you? 4 of you? 5 of you? Yeah. 408 mosses. I told you they were diverse. But look down there, 2,871 fruitifers, flowering plants in the state of Colorado, in 127 different families. Isn't that something? How many of them have you seen? How many of you keep track of the wildflowers that you see? Keep a record so you can remember. So you're going with the Fibber-McGee program instead of the classification program, is that right? Maybe you'll remember it, maybe you won't. Do I have to put you people in remedial wildlifing? This is monkshood in Colorado, but its sibling species over in Europe are called wolfbane, because from the 1300s all the way into the early 1900s, there were cultures over there that actually practiced the belief that there were werewolves, but that this plant would keep the werewolves away. So they would plant them in window boxes and along the path up to the door and around the house. And you could go up to these people and say, have you ever really seen a werewolf? And they'd say, no, the wolfbane works. And so, you know, it's only been in the last 40 or 50 years that whole idea of werewolves has kind of faded away into Hollywood fiction. But just saying, there aren't any werewolves in Colorado because we have... Yeah, no, never mind. So, the top 10 most diverse families of fruitifers in Colorado, the Senecios, a lot of people would call those sunflowers, but the Senecios outnumber them. 472 different kinds of those things in Colorado. Anybody having ragweed issues right now? Ragweed is in that family. All of the ragweed species. 332 grasses, the milk vetches, we have 207 in Colorado. 175 different mustards. Most people only know Dijon and French's. And there are a lot more than just that. Sedges, 157. If you eat Oriental food, you're probably familiar with a well-known sedge over there. When it's in our food, we call it water chestnut. But chestnuts are related to oaks, and these things are not related to oaks, and they grow in marshy areas, and so they're sedges, not chestnuts. 93 members of the rose family here in Colorado. Would you have believed that? That's kind of remarkable. 89 pens. The sulfur flowers right there, that's the family that includes the plants that we grind up the fruits into a powder so we can make buckwheat pancakes. The buckwheats are in the sulfur flower family. And then hound tongues and campions and what have you. So, thing 3, fruitifers are the most diverse phylum of plants in Colorado. That brings us to mushrooms, which is a set of ongoing problems that drive me crazy. First, mushrooms have no identity of their own. They are the reproductive structure of a parent fungus. And it's the parent fungus that has the identity. It's like taking a feather off of the bird. The feather has no identity. It's the bird that grew the feather that has the identity. You look at a rose, and you look at the flower because it's pretty. It's not the flower that has the identity. It's the whole plant that grew the flower. But when it comes to mushrooms, people talk in terms of mushrooms as if they are the entity, but they are simply the feather on the bird, the flower on the rose. They are the reproductive structure of a much bigger parent fungus. And yet we talk about the mushrooms having identity. It's a bit of a challenge. Many of our fungi, especially lichens, have been found to be multiple species, and they were treated as one species for decades, if not centuries. And now, with new knowledge, we're able to take them in the laboratory and test a variety of things and come to the conclusion this isn't one species that's different in a bunch of places. It's a bunch of different species. One of the old man beards, you know that lichen, that fuzzy lichen up on the trees, up in the spruce forests and in the mountains? One species of that lives here in Colorado was found to be 15 species instead of one. But you can't tell them apart unless you do them in the laboratory. Some fungi require laboratory analysis to verify their identity. And I mean, we don't have access to the kinds of instruments and the chemicals and that sort of thing. And so the best we can do is identify them to a genus, but we can't get them to a species. And that's not very gratifying unless you embrace the idea of classification. And finally, no single book or even a set of books covers all of the mushroom-bearing fungi in the state of Colorado. I used to teach mushroom ID classes for the Osher program at CSU and for the seminar program up at Rocky Mountain National Park. And I can't tell you how frustrating it was to go out in the field, and the first 22 mushrooms we always found weren't in the books. And so we couldn't identify them. And it's just like, oh, come on. But there are so many mushrooms in Colorado, it would take a book this big and that thick to cover them all, or you'd need a set of smaller books. But that would be better than not covering them at all. So, we also have some fungus species that produce mushrooms that are edible to some people and not edible to others. So if this person eats the mushroom, they think it's tasty and life goes on and life's wonderful. But this other person eats the same mushroom from the same dish, so to speak, and all of a sudden they have blurry vision and they're wobbly, or they get sick to their stomach, or all that kind of thing, and it can last for days before it goes away. And so we're not done figuring out the chemistry of these things yet to figure out why some people react the way they do and others react differently. But in this case, these two mushrooms, they both come out in the snowmelt of the spring of the year. So they're up in the lodgepole pine forest, and as the snow is melting off, these guys come up, and the black morel over here is part of the morel group that is considered to be some of the choicest of all the wild mushrooms to pick and eat. And I eat them, and they taste better than the store-bought mushrooms. But you can see the similarity to this one over here, which is a false morel, and it grows in the same area. Well, this one produces a chemical known as gyrometrin, and when it heats up, it converts it into a completely different chemical that's used as rocket fuel. I have limits, people. However, when this was originally named over in Europe, because it lives in both continents, they gave it the Latin name esculenta, which means good to eat. Which means Latin names aren't worth all that much, and they aren't all that scientific, so don't get carried away with Latin names. But it could explain a few things. I mean, if they're eating this in Europe and it makes rocket fuel, that may explain Elton John's song, Rocket Man. I'm just thinking out loud here. Then we have a fungus collection at the Denver Botanic Gardens that includes over 2,300 species, and almost all of them are mushroom-bearing fungi, but some of them are lichens. And the problem is we have no documentation of the microfungi in Colorado, like yeasts. We know we have wild yeast living in the state of Colorado, but what we don't know is how many. We don't know if we have 20, 120, 1,020, because nobody has gone to work to find and document the various kinds of yeasts in the state of Colorado. For a lot of people, the only yeast that matters is in the brewery. Just saying. So, we're not through learning about these things as yet. So, thing 4, mushrooms have no identity of their own. It's the parent fungus that has the identity. Animals. These are a lot easier to fathom, are they not? Because we're more familiar with them. And who could not fall in love with a face like that? That is a female elk bedded down in a front yard in Estes Park, and she's chewing her cud, and she couldn't care less that I was there. It's just kind of like, don't step on my paws. So, she was just cute. You know, when I see her, I just can't help but smile. We have two groups of animals, the invertebrate animals, so named because they have no internal skeleton system of bone or cartilage, so they have no vertebrae, and that's why they get the name invertebrate. They have no dorsal nerve cord that coordinates the musculature and the body functions, and they have the term invertebrate is descriptive. It is not a specific category of classification. So it's not diagnostic, but it's descriptive of various life forms. So we have sponges in Colorado. Did you know that? Yeah, I've told you before, but repetition is how you remember things. Get it in the right cubby hole in the memory instead of in Fibber McGee's closet. We have 4 different kinds of sponges. We also have little clams. These are pill clams. Sometimes they're called pea clams. And this one, full grown, it's only as big around as an eraser on a pencil. And then you can see the little foot coming out right here, so it can crawl away. So we've got mollusks in Colorado, we got sponges in Colorado, and we have annelids. And the annelids include things that you know as earthworms, right? What's the most famous earthworm? Night crawlers, you betcha. And here is a leech crawling among the sponges. And the sponges have no blood, so they have nothing to worry about. If there is a sponge-sucking leech out there, I want to find it and know about it. And then we have tardigrades. Have you seen these before? How cute are they? I've told you about tardigrades, right? And you could pass a quiz if I gave it right now? Or do you need a little review? Review, okay. These things are amazing in that they can survive in the vapors above liquid nitrogen, and they can survive that cold temperature for about 2 days. They can survive boiling water. And if you dry them out, as they're drying out, all the fluid in their body converts to a liquid sugar known as sorbitol, and they're able to go dormant. And we now have proof that they can survive over 100 years as these dried out little things, and then you put them in a drop of water, and within 24 hours it revives them. 100 years. Isn't that amazing? So you just heard about the Israeli rocket that crash landed on the moon, and what was aboard? Tardigrades. Is that a science fiction story waiting to be told? We're going to go to the moon in another 5 or 10 or 20 or 40 years whenever somebody gets around to it, and the tardigrades are going to be waiting for us. So, and then there are arthropods. They're probably the most studied animals in Colorado because they have such a huge influence on agriculture, public health, resource management, veterinary health, and all that sort of thing. And among the arthropods are the little guys like this jumping spider on my finger. And I show this over and over again because I am so proud. I was raised in a family of arachnophobes. My sister would go almost hysterical just seeing a spider. My mom was terrified of them, my grandmother, my cousins, my aunts. And so I grew up in this environment that you run and scream when you see a spider. And so suddenly I'm in my 20s and I'm thinking, you know what? I'm a naturalist and I've got an academic background. I should be able to get over this fear of spiders. So I started reading about them and I came across some amazing stuff, and the next thing I knew is I was putting the book down and going outside to find the spider that the guy was writing about just to watch it and that sort of thing. So now spiders can crawl on me and it doesn't creep me out at all. My wife is still going, ah, but I'm fine. So, the invertebrates divide into groups like sponges. We have 4 in Colorado. Annelids, those are the segmented worms. We have 14 species of earthworms in Colorado, and not one of them is a native species. They've all been brought in by people. And I'm an aspen grove guy. I got involved with little owls, flammulated owls and pygmy owls way back in the 70s, and they live in aspen groves. So I have spent an enormous amount of time watching those little owls nesting and raising their young. And 5 years ago, for the first time, I came across a flammulated owl that came back to the nest cavity with a worm in its mouth. And come to find out, a European earthworm has been brought into North America, and it is a high elevation worm and it loves the aspen groves. And it's here to stay. If you see an earthworm while you're hiking up in the aspens of Colorado, that is a worm from another continent. How about that for a detail?
How do we know that? Because there's nothing in between?
Yeah, because they weren't here before. They were never found 100 years ago or 30 years ago. And then all of a sudden they show up. And that means somehow or other people transported them here. We got 20 different kinds of leeches, and we have 18 bivalves. Those are the little clam-like things. One of the bivalves in Colorado is as big as my hand, or even a little bit bigger. And they're right here in Lake Loveland. And then we have gastropods. Those are snails and slugs, and we've got at least 50 of those. The aquatic snails have been well documented, and there have been volunteers that have scoured all of Colorado, plains, mountains, canyon country, and they've collected snails, and we've documented what species we have in Colorado and all of that. But what has not been done is the collecting and documenting of terrestrial snails instead of aquatic snails. And we have a bunch of terrestrial snails, and a few of the little tiny ones that never get very big have a big role to play in wildlife management. Because the way it works is these snails have these roundworms called lungworms inside them, and these little snails are feeding on plants, and along comes a bighorn sheep. It eats the plant, but it also eats the snail. And when the lungworm is freed inside the gut of the bighorn sheep, it burrows through the intestinal wall into a blood vessel, and it moves around the sheep's body until it gets to the lungs. Then it leaves the blood vessels and takes up residence in the bronchioles of the lungs and lays more eggs. Well, the eggs cause irritation for the bighorn sheep, and it causes the development of sputum, so the sheep go and they're clearing their throats, their lungs, and then they swallow it. They pass these eggs in their fecal material, and the youngsters hatch, and as they crawl out, they find the worms, and they burrow into the worms, and it starts the life cycle all over again. So when it comes to resource management, you need to know which worms harbor the lungworms as an intermediate host, and you need to know one roundworm from another, so that when you're dealing with these sick bighorn sheep, you can treat an area to minimize the parasite. But if you don't know one snail from another and one worm from another, how do you treat anything? And so suddenly classification matters. And then we know we have at least 6 different kinds of tardigrades in Colorado, but nobody has really gone to work to collect them all and document them all, so we don't know if we've got 16 or 112 or whatever, but they're here. So now the arthropods. Arthro means joint, pod means foot, means joint-footed. They're the most widely geographically distributed group of organisms on the planet. They have the most species, and they're the most academically studied because of what I've said before. They influence public health, personal health, agriculture, all of that sort of thing. And so we have crustaceans, but we have no idea how many crustaceans are in Colorado, because all those little swimmy things in the water, copepods and amphipods, what have you, nobody's traveled Colorado to collect them to figure out whether we got 100 kinds or 1,000 kinds, so we don't know. We do know we have 8 different species of crayfishes, and one of them was just found 2 or 3 years ago. It's called the rusty crayfish, and when it gets introduced into new waters, it proliferates and causes a lot of ecological destruction. So our state wildlife agency is trying to suppress it and get rid of it so it doesn't end up by spreading throughout the state. We have 25 different centipedes in Colorado. They're all venomous. One of them gets to be 5 to 6 inches long, and it lives in the rock piles out here in the foothills just west of town. You can go out to Devil's Backbone or up to Horsetooth Mountain or Laurie State Park and just turn over the rocks, and they're underneath there. And every once in a while, instead of having a little 2-inch centipede, you get one of these 5 or 6 inchers, and it's kind of like, woo! And they're kind of amazing. Symphylans look like centipedes, but they're non-venomous. They only have 12 pairs of legs instead of 30 or 40 pairs. And they live in association with people. You're likely to have seen them in your bathroom or on a kitchen floor, behind the water heater, underneath the dryer, that sort of thing. So it's not surprising to see them in houses, but they're totally harmless. And then we have millipedes. They're non-venomous. They have at least 36 pairs of legs, and we have 30 species in the state of Colorado. The biggest one lives in Asia, gets to be over a foot long, and it has 750 pairs of legs. Aren't you glad you don't have to buy shoes for one of those guys? Yeah, or darn socks. So, among the arachnids, we have acrids, which are mites and ticks. We know we have at least 36 tick species in the state of Colorado. 6 of those afflict people. And the others are unique to other groups, like lizards. You never think of lizards as being vulnerable to ticks, but there are tick species that only pick on lizards. The things you can learn on a Wednesday evening, I'm telling you. So we don't know how many of those guys are around. How many of you go around collecting dust mites in your house? Do you vacuum? Well, just call that mite collection. Then we have Apilionids. Some people call them daddy longlegs. I have a problem with that name because half of them are women. And how do you have a female daddy? Oh, wait a minute. In today's culture, never mind. I don't want to talk it now. And then we have harvestmen, but there again, half of them are females. So do we have harvest women? So those are not the best names. I just call them Apilionids. I'm not sure how many we have in Colorado, but if I remember correctly, it's something around 100 to 115, but don't hold me to that number. I might be remembering it incorrectly. Then we have sulfugids. Some people call them sun spiders, but they're not spiders. Others call them wind scorpions, but they're not scorpions. Why call them what they aren't? That makes no sense. So I call them sulfugids. There are 15 of them in Colorado. We have pseudoscorpions, 20 plus, but nobody's ever done a thorough study to know how many more than 20 we have, but we know we have at least 20. Do you know anything about pseudoscorpions? Have you ever even heard of pseudoscorpions? This could make Wednesday night worthwhile for you. They're the shape of watermelon seeds, and a really big one is just shy of a ½ an inch long. But they don't have the tail and the stinger of a scorpion, but they have the front pinchers of a scorpion. And since they can't fly, and since most of them are little, most of them are the size of a head of a pin or so, they can't get from here to there very expediently, so they just sort of hang out. And when this big beetle comes along, they grab a hold of the beetle flies over to another tree, and they hop off. And so they actually hitchhike, but not with the beetle's permission, so they're kind of sneaking sort of thing. So the beetle is sort of a greyhound bus for the pseudoscorpions. And then they prey on things like little flies, little wasps, gnats, mites, that sort of thing. Then we have scorpions, 7 different kinds in Colorado. We do not have the deadly kind, and we don't have the kind that really hurt. If you got stung by one of our scorpions, it wouldn't hurt any worse than a honeybee or a yellow jacket, which is bad enough. And then we have spiders. We have over 650 kinds of spiders. Paula Cushing was hired by the Denver Museum of Natural History back in 1998. And when she got there, she found out there was no spider collection and there was no search for spider diversity in the state of Colorado. So she got a grant to initiate a spider collection and spider identification. And she used that money to set up classes to teach people how to collect them and then how to identify them and then bring them to her. So these could cover more of Colorado than she could by herself. Well, over the course of the last 21 years, she's been able to document, I think the number now is 678 species of spiders in the state of Colorado. But I don't know the exact number. That's just kind of in my memory, but I'm not entirely sure. That is a lot of different kinds of spiders. So, thing 5, spiders constitute an order of arachnids the way butterflies are an order of insects. So, spider and insect are not sibling categories in the classification system. Arachnid and insect are sibling categories. And then spiders are a notch down. Does that make sense? Sure it does. The correct answer is yes, Kevin. That was pretty weak, people. That we're getting better. So there's a harvestman or an Apilionid up there. If you go on the internet and search around, you will find sites that will tell you these are the most poisonous things on planet Earth. And their venom is more potent than a cobra or those nasty octopuses. And if they bite you, you're really in trouble and what have you. Well, that is biologically illiterate. We know of about 1,600 species of these things worldwide, and not one of them produces venom. Not one. And so people who still claim that these things are poisonous, they are biologically illiterate, and you should not let them manage your financial affairs. And then we have these guys. That is a sulfugid. And full grown, they're about 3/4 of an inch to an inch long. They have 4 jaws that open up like this, and they capture and eat things like crickets and moths. And it's kind of like, feel free to eat all of them in my garage you want to. They are not venomous, and they're only out for about a month a year. From about the last week of June to about the 3rd week of July is their time where the adults are above ground and you can find them. And the rest of the year, they are nymphs down in the ground and you can't find them. So we're past the time where you could find them this year, so mark it on your calendar and make it a priority to look for them next June. And then we have the spiders like this one down here. That is my right hand, like this, and that thing's crawling on it. Does that give you an idea how big she is? Yeah, that is a banded argiope. She's one of those that makes the circular wheel-like webs, and they're really common around here. They're here in Loveland, Pawnee grassland, and what have you. When I was 15, if that spider came within 3 inches, my heart would have stopped and you would have had to get me medical care. And now they crawl on me and it doesn't bother me a bit. So if you are one of those people that is creeped out by spiders, I'm here to tell you, you can overcome it. Seriously. So these are some of the orders of insects. Actually, they're all the orders in the state of Colorado. We're not sure how many beetles or bugs are in the state. We don't know how many flies or grasshoppers. But these other groups have been documented pretty well, and we've got a good number, are chewing lice that only affect birds. And the sucking lice, there are not that very many of them in Colorado. So, thing 6, Colorado supports probably around 45,000 insect species. Isn't that amazing? And most of them are in my house. This window, that light fixture just came in on the dog. So, as a summary, we have 4 sponges, 35 plus segmented worms, annelids. We have maybe 100 or so mollusks. We've got at least 6 tardigrades. If we count all the crustaceans, centipedes, and everything else we have, we're probably at or over 50,000 arthropods. That brings us now to the vertebrates. These are animals that have internal bone or cartilage skeletons, and so they have vertebrae, hence the name vertebrate. They have dorsal nerve cords that coordinate the body function, and the name vertebrata is actually part of a classification category, so it's diagnostic, not just descriptive. In the fish group, we used to have an eel that made it into Colorado. I've told you about the American eel that used to come in on the Rio Grande, the Arkansas, the South Platte. We brought 2 herrings to Colorado, both as game fish and as food fish for walleyes and for pike. We've got 36 different kinds of minnows in Colorado. Right now, our biggest one is the Colorado pike minnow, and it routinely is reaching 4 feet and around 40 pounds. That's why I tell you with all sincerity, minnow is a kind of fish, not a size of fish. All little fishes are not minnows, and all minnows are not little fishes. And so when we find bones in old wood rat collections and nest piles in the canyon country, we can find those bones, we can identify what animal they came from, we can measure the bone and do the math and figure out how big the animal was based on the size of the bone and the kind of bone. And we know from that material that these pike minnows used to reach 6 feet and 130 pounds. Do I need to explain one more time why minnow is not a size of fish? It's a kind of fish. Yeah, so that's quite a few. 16 different salmons, only 2 of them are native to Colorado. The cutthroat trout and the mountain whitefish. The other 14 have been brought in by people. So thing 7, almost but not quite, 2 non-native fish species now live in or have lived in Colorado for every native fish species. Isn't that remarkable? I'll show you the numbers more in a moment. We have 5 different turtles and 4 different families, including the box turtle and the common snapping turtle. The big snappers can weigh 30 pounds and be 3 feet long. We have 2 groups of amphibians. The caudatans produce tails, those are salamanders, and the anurans don't produce tails, and that includes toads and frogs and tree frogs. And because we have so many different groups there, it's not appropriate to use the term frog for all of them. Frogs just refer to one particular family with 4 species. So that's a tiger salamander, and that is a striped chorus frog. So, Thane 8, only 1 salamander species lives wild in Colorado. I feel deprived. We should have more than that, but for some reason, we didn't get them. So, squamates. People used to call these reptiles, but now the old idea of what we used to call reptiles is understood to be artificial and doesn't reflect the natural relatedness of thing, and the term reptile is falling out of use in scholarship. And so we refer to lizards and snakes collectively as squamates. And we have 19 different lizards in Colorado and 26 different snakes. And among the snakes, we have 2 different species of rattlesnake. Just to give you a quick one, if you look at the medical records, you are more likely to die of influenza if you don't get an influenza vaccine than you are to die of a rattlesnake bite in the state of Colorado. The rattlesnakes we have just don't have that severe of toxin. It hurts like crazy, it can make you sick, but very few people die of it. But a lot more people die of influenza because a lot of people don't think, I don't want to get a shot because the shot gives you the flu. Those are people who don't understand vaccinations. So, Thing 9, there are 3 horned lizard species in Colorado and not one of them is a toad. If you look at this guy, you see the scales? Toads don't have scales. Count the toes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Toads only have 4 toes on the front foot. That is a lizard, not a toad. From here on out, you're calling them horned lizards, not horny toads. If you do, I have a taser and I'll use it. Horned lizards. So these are the birds in Colorado. Do I have any bird enthusiasts here? Some of you know white meat from dark meat, southern fried from oven baked, that sort of thing. Well, these are all the orders in Colorado, and some of the bird groups don't include the parrots and they don't include the tinamous, but then they include other things, and it's like you have one set of rules for one bird and a different set of rules for another bird, and that means your list lacks credibility. I use the same set of rules for everything, and that's why I have more species on my list than the Colorado field ornithologist or the Denver field ornithologist. Tinamous were raised at a bird farm across from where Anheuser-Busch is, up north of Fort Collins. And they raised them for 4 years, and for 3 winters they turned them loose down in Baca County. And these tinamous are native to Argentina. And the idea was to establish them as a huntable game bird, a huntable species. What they didn't do is figure out that climate matters, and even though the vegetation was similar, the winter climate is different. Down there, a cold winter was 40 degrees where these birds live, and down in Baca County in a cold winter, it's below 0. And so for 3 years, they released these birds in October to release the young birds to get them established. None of them survived for 3 years, so they quit doing it. You know, if you would have looked into the ecology of the species, you might not have wasted that much time and effort. And then parrots. Monk parakeets have nested in 5 different cities along the Front Range. Colorado Springs, Wheat Ridge, Arvada. And even though they have nested and lived wild without human assistance for 20 years, they're not included on state bird checklists because people brought them. Well, guess what? People brought pheasants, and those are on the list. People brought chukars, and those are on the list. Duh! So why do you include one and you exclude another one? Because you're not credible. This is why my list is better than theirs. What's that? Yeah. So you notice the falcons are right there next to the parrots. New research that was done by a large team of scientists and was very thorough shows that falcons and parrots share more in common and had a common ancestor than falcons and hawks. And so today, the falcons are in an order by themselves, and they're placed close to the parrots, and they're removed from the hawks because the genetics, the proteins, the body structure, everything about them says we share more in common with parrots than we do with hawks. And so now they're a separate group. Prairie falcons in this area, American kestrels, thing 10, falcons and hawks are not closely related, but falcons and parrots are. That brings us to the mammals. Opossums and armadillos have found their way into Colorado. We have 59 different rodents, 18 bats. Some people count horses, other people don't. And it's back to, well, people brought them. Well, we brought moose to Colorado and we count them. And now we have horses in Colorado. Why wouldn't you count them? Because these are not people that think very deeply. I'm just saying. So, thing 11, 9-banded armadillos and Virginia opossums found their way across the Great Plains and into Colorado on their own by the way people changed the environment and changed the ecosystems out on the plains, and they could move through plant communities that are more desirable for them. So Virginia opossums have been found in Risk Canyon, Laurie State Park, just right west of town, up in Fort Collins. They're probably west of town here in the Loveland area. They're out east in the plains. Fort Morgan, Sterling has opossums and what have you. The armadillos are over on the Kansas border, over in Kit Carson County and Prowers County and Baca County. But they're there. And then we have this summary. We have 52 species of fishes that have been documented as native to the state of Colorado, but we have got 130 different kinds of fishes that have been found living in the state overall. Goldfishes did not find their way into City Park by themselves. People had them in a fishbowl or in an aquarium. They got tired of them. They turned them loose, and they survived just fine. And next thing you know is you have goldfish living wild in the state of Colorado. 5 turtles, 18 amphibians, 45 squamates, 515 birds, and 131 different mammals. Phew. Thing 12. In Colorado today, wildlife watchers outnumber hunters and fishers combined, and they exert a greater influence on local commerce and the state economy. How many of you knew that? Isn't that something? That's just amazing. They rent hotel rooms, motel rooms, they buy gas, they eat in restaurants and all that sort of thing. And because there are more of them, they have more of an impact. So, when considering the wildlife diversity of a place like Colorado, life itself can become a destination, which raises an interesting question for conversation, discussion. Have you really seen Colorado if you haven't seen all 11 woodpeckers, all 14 species of paintbrush, all the turtles and lizards, every bat and shrew? Knowing what lives out there in the backyard and beyond becomes a way to set goals and to prioritize them and to get going. So life awaits your admiration.
I've been there.
Thanks for coming, and I'll see you next time.